All righty. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Richard Gibbons, Administrative Assistant here at Cohasset Elder Affairs. Along with the Paul Pratt Memorial Library, we would like to thank you for joining us for today's program, LGBTQ 101. It is my pleasure at this time to introduce our guest speaker and the Executive Director for the History Project, Joan Ilacqua. Joan, take it away, and thank you so much, everybody, for joining us.
Thanks.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the intro, and thank you for everyone who could be here today. I'm Joan Ilacqua. I am Executive Director of the History Project. We document, preserve, and share the history of the LGBTQ communities in Greater Boston, but we're from Massachusetts. We kind of focus on the state as a whole and New England regionally. I live up here in Quincy, so I'm not that far from you. I think, what is it? You just hop on Route 3A at least until I see the ocean that's a little prettier than Wollaston, don't tell my neighbors. But I grew up in Plymouth. So doing these kinds of events on the South Shore is really meaningful for me. So I'm happy to be here. I'm gonna share my screen. All right, and can you folks all see? There should be just like a white presentation, cool. And so for today, we are recording this presentation. We are also, I left a lot of time for Q&A. So if you have a question, we'll have time to answer them and have a discussion at the end, but you can feel free if you don't want to ask it out loud to use the chat, to send me a private message, whatever you would like to do, whatever you're comfortable with here. And let me pull up my notes that I stay on track today to go along with the presentation. Sorry, I have two screens. There we go. So, like I said, sort of an overall agenda for us. I have an introduction about the History Project. I have a whole list of resources and links for you. So if there's anything I talk about that you want to learn more about, you'll have the list of those links to go check up on later, or if there's something you want to check on, or if something you want to share with friends. And I'll share that link in the chat too, so you can click on it later on. So we're going to talk a little bit, there'll be a little history about gender identity, about labels around sexual orientation, about how to use pronouns and sort of what pronouns folks are using, and then a list of support and information for community organizations, regardless of if you're part of the LGBTQ community, an ally, or just kind of curious to learn more. So the History Project, we've been around since 1980. We, like I said, document, preserve, and share LGBTQ history. Our earliest collections that we have date to about the 1940s. We have photographs of private house parties from World War II. And then our more recent collections are from now, or from protests happening now, from organizations that are active now. So basically, I like to say, if you are curious about any part of LGBTQ history, we can point you in the right direction. We started as an organization because in 1980 in particular, gay and lesbian people, as they were identifying themselves then, wanted to know about people like them in history. And if you heard, we're here, we're queer, we have always been in Massachusetts. There have always been gay people throughout time here. And so they came together to find those people, to share information about them. And now we exist to make sure that that history is always easily available. So the short history here is basically a history of labels and terminology. When you talk about the movement for gay liberation, or the gay rights movement, or the LGBTQ movement, we're mostly talking about after World War II to today. So before World War II, to find gay people in history, you have sort of coded language around sexual orientation and attraction. And I put some examples on the slide. Some of those are like women in Boston marriages, where there are two women in one relationship, and maybe they're roommates, maybe they're not. Or sapphic is another word for women who love women. Words like inverts, or Uranian love, or dandies, or confirmed bachelor generally pertain to who we would now label as gay men. And you'd see this sort of language written about people. You know, you may have heard like, oh, he was a confirmed bachelor, or he lived with a roommate, or something along that line. In the 1950s and after World War II, really, the word homophile starts being used. And that word probably isn't super familiar unless you're a historian of LGBTQ history, because it's gone out of fashion. But early gay rights organizations like the Mattachine Society, the Daughters of Bilitis, who are these 1950s and 1960s gay rights organizations, liked the word homophile because it used the prefix homo, meaning the same, and then the suffix phile, meaning love. So they felt like it, you know, was sort of normalizing the relationships they were in, normalizing the people that they wanted to be without focusing on the sexual side of things. By the time we get to like the Stonewall riots in 1969 and Pride celebrations, the homophile organizations are organizing those, but the term goes out of usage by the time the 1970s come around. And that's when you start to hear more often people describe themselves as gay, as lesbian, as bisexual. And we'll get into exactly what those terms all mean. And then as time goes on and we hit the 90s, you start to hear people identify as transgender, as queer, as asexual, as pansexual. And those words are more common now. And that doesn't mean the word transgender in particular dates to about the 1960s, but you don't see it in common usage until around the 90s. So that's kind of the broad strokes. How did we get from there to here on what is LGBTQ? And what I really want to talk what I really want to talk to you about today is sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, and sex. What are these things? What are the labels people use? How do they know? And if I'm not part of this community, what can I do as an ally, or at least an informed person to interact with this community? And so we're starting here with gender expression, gender identity, and sex. And I have an exercise called the Gender Unicorn. And this is, actually I see high school students and college students using this most of the time. It is this resource created by the Trans Student Educational Resources Group. It's totally free online, and it sort of gives you the opportunity to think about your own life and how you identify yourself, how you express yourself, you know, what your sex assigned at birth, what you were born as, what's on your birth certificate, and who you're attracted to. Because, you know, there's not a one size fits all necessarily answer here. But to kind of go through the list of what this coloring book page is showing you is, you know, gender identity at the top is an internal self, an internal sense of being male, being female, maybe being neither, maybe feeling like you're both. Your gender identity is not necessarily the same as your gender expression or the sex that you were assigned at birth. And so to use me as an example, my gender identity is female. I identify as a woman. I was born as a woman, and I present as a woman. I like to dress pretty femininely. I have on lipstick today. I dress like a librarian, so, you know, take that for what you will. But so my gender identity is female. Even though that corresponds with the sex on my birth certificate, it doesn't have to. Gender identity doesn't have to do with science or biology necessarily. It has to do with your sense of self. Gender expression is how you present that self. So like I said, I like to dress femininely. I like to wear dresses. I like to, you know, do my hair with hair. I just went back to the hair salon after a year of COVID-19. Other examples of gender expression or presentation might be how you show your gender identity through your voice. through the accessories you choose, through the makeup that you wear. And that gender expression could be masculine, like you could be a tomboy, it could be feminine, or it could be neither or both. It doesn't have to be one or the other. It's not, a binary of options. When you get to sex assigned at birth, that's specifically a classification based on a combination of your anatomy, your hormones, and your chromosomes. And so at birth, a person might be assigned male or female. They might be assigned intersex or a different sex altogether. Intersex isn't the only option if you aren't male or female. But the thing about sex assigned at birth is that it doesn't have to necessarily match your gender identity or expression. So if you identify in a way that doesn't fit with what your sex is assigned at birth, you're probably part of the trans community. You're part of, or you are of trans experience is another way of thinking about that. And so, like I said, again, using me as an example, I identify as female, my gender identity expression is feminine, my sex assigned at birth was female. When we get to physically attracted to, personally, I'm attracted to women, and that makes me a lesbian. I'm also emotionally attracted to women. Sexual or physical attraction and emotional attraction don't have to exactly match, but you have options here to think through. I find, and looking at this audience here, most of you are probably, let's say I'm 32, you're probably my age or potentially older than that. People coming up now, I think, especially youth, are more open to thinking about these different categories and scales of identity, expression, and attraction. And it's actually kind of exciting to see how people are describing themselves, what they're interested in, and how they're finding community around these sorts of labels. That's not to say that there aren't older folks who are trans or who are non-binary or use one of those other identifiers. But, I think it's something that is sort of changing over time. But this is a basis for starting to think about this conversation, sort of understand what people are talking about when they say, I'm part of this community, or I'm, interested in this type of person, or that sort of thing. And that kind of leads, like I said, the end of that list is, who are you romantically or sexually interested in? And that leads into sexual orientation, which is specifically about who you are either romantically or sexually attracted to. LGBTQ or gay and lesbian or homosexual even are sort of the baseline of this part of the conversation. I like to use this graphic of the rainbow flags to show how many different communities and identities we're talking about here, that there are a lot of different terms that people have claimed for themselves and use over time to describe themselves as part of this community. And so you don't have to memorize the flags or anything like that. I'm a professional gay person and I still get some of them confused, but it's good to know, what people are talking about and thinking about. So about sexual orientation in particular, gay and lesbian correspond directly to your gender and your sexual attraction. A gay man is a man who is interested in other men. A lesbian is a woman who's interested in other women. Bisexual, or sometimes pansexual or bi plus is sometimes what this community is called now, is somebody who's interested in more than one gender. It could be a woman interested in women and men, a man interested in men and women, a woman interested in everyone's gender identity, or something along that line. Whereas trans corresponds directly to the gender identity of a person that does not correspond with their sex assigned at birth. So Your birth certificate might say you're a woman, and you might not agree with that. You might not express yourself as a woman would. And you could express yourself as being a masculine person. You could call yourself a man. You could say that you're neither or both, and that person might call themselves genderqueer or non-binary or gender non-conforming. And they're all part of this trans community. The flags here are a lot more recent than the gay pride flag. The gay pride flag was created in 1978. Whereas with the advent of the internet and online communities where people are meeting each other and talking through how they feel and how they express themselves, other pride flags have been created and used, most of which are within the last 10 years. So you have groups like genderqueer people who might be of trans experience, but their expression may change, or they may feel both masculine and feminine, or they may be non-binary, which kind of can mean feeling masculine and feminine or neither at the same time. It's sort of really up to the person defining themselves. Asexual and aromantic are both relatively recent community identifiers. Someone who's asexual is somebody who feels no sexual attraction toward another person, regardless of they're a man, a woman, a trans person, a binary person. Aromantic is similar to asexual, except you have no romantic interest in another person. Whereas something like the pansexual pride flag is kind of like a more expansive version of being bisexual. It is to be interested in other people, to follow, as the kids say, hearts, not parts. You might be interested in anyone. There's not one specific gender or expression of person that you're interested in. And that's essentially the LGBTQ: lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer. Queer, as a definition, changes based on who's talking about it. I find sort of colloquially, people who are a little younger tend to use the word queer to describe everyone who's part of this community, everyone who might be gay or trans or bisexual or questioning. Some people who are of I would say the Stonewall generation, who might be a Gen X or baby boomer, don't like the word queer. It has been used as a slur over time, whereas some other people have reclaimed it to be an identifier for the entire community. Some folks use the word queer to define that they're interested in anyone with no labels, or that, you know, like I said, I identify as a lesbian, but I'm a historian. I love the word lesbian. I might call myself queer, but I'm still interested solely in other women, regardless of what their gender assigned at birth might be. And so queer works as an identifier for me as well. Yeah, I think that's I just want to take a moment to see, are there any questions before I move on? We're going to start talking about pronouns and sort of how to ask people about these things. But this is kind of a lot of information to start with.
No, this has been helpful, Joan, because I, you know, I'm a grandmother, and I know my grandkids, they're so much more knowledgeable, and I want to be able to understand what is going on, because what I'm realizing is kids seem to be younger than in my generation, recognizing how they feel emotionally, which I think is good, but it's also, it's difficult to completely understand it. And that's why I'm taking the course. Thank you.
Oh yeah, no, absolutely. And I will say again, is sort of I joke that I should have a website that says Joan Ilacqua, professional lesbian. Like that should be my title. But I'm also constantly learning because things are changing and people are finding terms and communities that fit more closely with how they feel. And that's not to say it's not like, 1990 hit and suddenly bisexuals popped out of nowhere or something like that. But before then, the term wasn't used as much, for example. And so, yeah, and kids today are pretty amazing. Yeah. I think both in terms of yep. knowing themselves, of being, brave and talking about these things, but also there's, it's a different world than it was even 10 years ago. There are more resources and information out there. There are more examples of celebrities and television shows. And who is it? Demi Lovato came out this morning as non-binary and uses they pronouns. And so, yeah, the world is changing. And it's good to sort of to be aware, but no one has to be an expert necessarily. As long as you're interested in asking questions, I think that's a good thing. So, that was my draft slide made it into the final presentation. So I have some pronoun examples and sort of some tips and tricks about pronoun usage. And so pronouns, I mean, if you have taken an elementary school English class, you know what a pronoun is. Most of the pronouns that people use to describe themselves are ones like she, her, hers, he, him, his, they, them, theirs, which especially in the last couple of years, I think there's been less of a fight over if that is grammatically correct or not to use they to refer to a single person. Most likely, if somebody has a particular preference about their pronouns, they're going to tell you about it. Or if you're here on Zoom, like with me today, I have my pronouns after my name. So you know that I use she, hers. I personally wouldn't be offended if somebody called me, they, them, but that's because it's not something that's super important to me. But, pronouns affirm and validate somebody's gender expression and experience. And so it's best to take the lead of people when they say, these are the pronouns that I prefer to use. These are the pronouns that I use to identify myself. There are other combinations of pronouns. Some people might say, I use they pronouns and she pronouns. I might use any pronouns. Less common, but still out there in the world are pronouns like per, pers, per, which admittedly I've only ever seen on the internet. And then Z and Zier, which became very popular in the 90s for a while and then is used less often now. And if you come across people using those pronouns, just sort of be aware that they're out there. There are more options than they, she, and he. But the thing to really keep in mind with pronouns, like I said, they're the easiest way to affirm and validate gender identity and experience. And you can't assume necessarily that because somebody may look to you to be masculine or feminine, that they use a certain set of pronouns. And I think that's a hard thing to train yourself to do. I know that as time has gone on, I've tried to use gender neutral terminology to describe groups of people, or if I don't know when someone's pronoun, saying like they said this or them over there, being a little bit more trying to train myself not to just obviously assumed that someone who's wearing pants identifies with he, him pronouns or something like that. If you're in a conversation with someone, one of the easiest ways to make sure that you're aware of what pronouns they use are to do a soft ask. And you could say something like, hi, I'm Joan and I use she, her pronouns. And that gives the other person the opportunity to offer their pronouns to you. Or you could ask without assuming, hi, I'm Joan, I use she, her pronouns. Carrie, what pronouns do you use? And sort of continue that conversation to just be aware. It is okay if you are wrong. You know, everyone messes up. You don't just, you don't come out of day one and you're at 100%. Everyone messes up. And if you're wrong, just apologize shortly and quickly. And, you know, for example, Carrie, sorry, you're the first person on my screen, you know.
No problem. I love being used as an example.
Okay, perfect. So, you know, Carrie, they said, oh, oops, sorry, Carrie, she said. And that's me assuming what pronouns you use, Carrie. I apologize for that. But, you know, don't make it a big deal. It's not the first time this has probably happened to a person. You know, and it's not about you and how it makes you feel. It's just about, you know, quick apology, an acknowledgement, and move on. If you have trouble with a certain person in your life who's changed their pronouns or who is trying out a new pronoun, practice with a friend. Don't practice with them because that's a little hard emotionally for them to kind of deal with, but practice with a friend or a partner. When, for example, in my life, when a friend of ours transitioned, we had essentially a pronoun swear jar. Every time you use the wrong pronoun with this person, you had to drop in a quarter. And when one person was still having trouble, we took her aside and practiced for a little while to make sure that we were on the right track. And, you know, if you hear someone else using the wrong pronouns for someone and you know what the right pronouns are, just jump in politely and say, you know, for example, again, Carrie, they said this. Oops, sorry. Carrie uses she, her pronouns. And then just move on and just normalize it. It's, like I said, it takes practice for everyone. It is, but it's not too hard. We use pronouns every day to describe lots of people. And if you sort of start training yourself to use some more neutral pronouns in your life, you'll get there. It'll take time. No one's gonna, there's no pronoun police. No one's gonna come after you if you mess up. But, you know, folks in your life who are using pronouns that don't, you know, weren't assigned to them at birth or who are of trans experience will really appreciate the work that you do to be welcoming and affirming to them. And I just have a picture up from the archives. There was a protest this summer, trans resistance for Black and Indigenous, queer and trans lives in Boston. That's part of our collection. And I thought the flag would go along with our pronoun conversation here. Does anyone have any questions about pronouns before I turn us over to some community resources where you could learn more? All right, if you think of anything, please feel free to use the chat, or like I said, we'll have time for questions at the end, but I just want to make sure we're all sort of on the same journey here with this discussion. So if you are curious about learning more about resources for either yourself or for LGBTQ people in your life, Massachusetts has an enormous wealth of riches of organizations that work directly with the LGBTQ community. So I've organized these out into a couple of different categories. This first one here is for LGBTQ youth and elders. And the first couple of organizations are groups like BAGLY, which is the Boston Alliance of LGBTQ Youth. There is a chapter of BAGLY on the South Shore called SHAGLY, the South Shore Alliance of GLBT Youth, who were meeting in, I feel like they were meeting in Duxbury. I should have double checked this. But that group in particular, SHAGLY on the South Shore, they have a group for youth in particular to get together and talk to each other and sort of share resources, and for parents and caretakers to get together and talk to each other and ask questions. And so, you know, groups like that sort of, like I said, there's a lot of information out there on the internet, but it gives folks a chance to support one another, ask questions, you know, see if there are other resources that they don't know about. and that sort of thing. Oh, there we go. And in the chat, Cohasset Pride Coalition, who are on Instagram and Facebook. There's Greater Boston PFLAG. PFLAG has awesome resources, not just for parents and friends of LGBTQ people. I frequently use PFLAG anytime I have questions about anything. If I want to learn about a resource, if I have questions about pronouns, if I have questions about gender identity, or about what groups are active across the state or across the country, PFLAG is where I go to. And there's a correction in the chat. It's the Cohasset Pride Project, not the Cohasset Pride Coalition. Two other groups you just know about: GLASS in Boston caters directly to LGBTQ youth of color, similar to how Bagley does, and GLISTEN exists to ensure rights for LGBTQ students in education. There's also several pride groups and resources out there for elderly people or for elders. Those include groups like the Boston Prime Timers, who are a social and educational organization, the LGBT Aging Project, which is out of Fenway Health, which works directly with people looking for help in healthcare or community support. They also run the LGBT Elders of Color group, which pre-COVID was meeting a couple of times a year to have a tea dance and social to ensure that LGBT elders of color weren't feeling isolated. There's an LGBTQ senior housing project in Hyde Park that's going to be going in the next couple of years. And then at Hebrew Senior Life, there's the Spiritual Care of LGBT Elders program, which again ensures that as folks who are out and proud, if they're going into assisted living facilities or retirement homes, that they feel that they aren't going back into the closet by moving into that kind of environment. And I have links to all of these organizations to share with you. For networking and socializing, again, there are a lot of organizations in the Boston area, and especially as we are still sort of in COVID times. I know Massachusetts is trying to reopen. A lot of these groups are doing events online. So some like the Locks Collective, which is the Lesbian of Color Symposium, and Men of Melanin Magic, put on social events and networking events and conferences specifically for LGBTQ people of color. Speak Out is the LGBTQ Speakers Bureau, and they do things like storytelling events. We just did an event with them last week about coming out stories and what I knew. The Bisexual Resource Center similarly has support groups for people who might be coming out as bi or bi plus, as well as resources on, so I'm bi, what does that mean? And the Mass Bears and Cubs are a kind of fraternal organization for gay men who might identify as a bear or a cub. A bear historically is like, a big, muscular, hairy guy is sort of the stereotype. The Mass Bears and Cubs don't check you at the door. So if they do an event, you don't have to be a bear to participate. But a lot of the work that they do is to give back to the community, to raise money for other organizations, and to have fun socializing while they do it. And then there are support lines to just be aware of if anyone is ever in crisis of some kind. There's the LGBT National Help Center, the Trevor Project, which is specifically for LGBTQ youth, and Trans Lifeline, which is specifically for trans people. And they have volunteers who staff these lines 24/7. So if there's someone in your life who is, in any kind of crisis, these are the places to go. And I will share with you on the resource list their website and their phone numbers so that you can get that information. And it's especially useful for youth or people who are still living at home, who might not be living in a home situation that's affirming to what their gender identity or sexual orientation is. But these organizations do really amazing work. And like I said, they're staffed by volunteers who are there to help. So you should know about them. And then finally, here's just a group of organizations that are out there kind of making change in the world. In Massachusetts, again, we've had marriage equality since 2004. There are laws in place to protect people in public accommodations. There are anti-hate crime laws. There's a gay bill of rights that we passed in the late 80s. But these groups are still out there ensuring that people have access to healthcare, to legal defense, to asylum if they're coming from a country that is not open or affirming to LGBTQ people or is actively hostile. So just like I said, I'll give you some links, but Mass Equality has shifted from lobbying to education. They do awesome work across the state. GLAD, the legal advocates and defenders for LGBTQ people, were instrumental in those gay rights bills, and they're still in Massachusetts and do a lot of pro bono work for folks who are experiencing discrimination across the country. Groups like Trans Resistance and Black and Pink, as well as the Transgender Emergency Fund I mixed two of them up. Trans Resistance, the Mass Trans Political Coalition, and the Trans Emergency Fund are providing services and support to trans people in Massachusetts. Black and Pink is specifically for incarcerated LGBTQ people and HIV positive people. The Asylum Task Force, which is out in Worcester, is one of the only organizations that supports people who are trying to seek asylum in the United States from start to finish. They help people for months and months to basically get their papers so that they can live in the United States as they work through the asylum or immigration process. And FinMy Health has been out there since the 80s supporting LGBTQ people in all aspects of health, so that, you know, when you go to the doctor at Fenway, you don't have to say, you know, they're culturally competent in working with LGBTQ people. Sometimes you talk to local doctors and they're like, what do you mean you're this, that, or the other thing? And so they're out there, and they also provide educational resources to local doctors. Nothing against town doctors. And now I have time, we have a lot of time for questions here. I've included here the link to the History Project's website. We're at historyproject.org. And like I said, if you're interested in basically any part of LGBTQ history in Massachusetts, we probably have something about it. Or if we don't have it, I can point you in the right direction. And if you have any questions at all, but you didn't think of them right now, or you didn't want to ask them in this event, please feel free to email me personally at info@historyproject.org. It comes directly to me, and I'm happy to either answer your question or point you in the right direction. And then I have a couple of questions in the chat. I'm going to close the share screen so I can see folks' faces. And so one of the questions is about email closings and pronouns. And the question is specifically, is by not putting my pronoun in my email considered insensitive? Should my pronoun be in my email sign off? For people who are cisgender, and I realize now I didn't define that when we were talking about trans people. To be cisgender is to identify with your sex assigned at birth. So I am a cisgender woman. It says woman on my, or girl on my birth certificate. I identify as a woman. I am cisgender. I always include my pronouns because it's easy, because it gives people more information about me. And it also shows people who might be of trans experience that I'm listening and I'm paying attention. And so by not including your pronouns, it's not like, all I can think of for an example is like anti-masking, but by not including your pronouns, you're not making a statement about not being inclusive to trans people, but it's a lot easier and I think more welcoming to just include them and to make it normal. And then that way, for folks who do use a pronoun like they, or who use a pronoun that doesn't necessarily directly reflect how they look, it's not weird for them to include it in their email signature, or on your Zoom name tag, or in other name tags when we get to go, back in real life to meet up with people. So yeah, I would just suggest if it's something easy for you to change, why not do it? You know, it's not a big deal, especially if you're cisgender. That's what's going on with that. Let's see. So do folks have other questions, and they don't have to be like pronouns or questions like that. They can be, you know, what are you doing for Pride, or what are you having for lunch later, if that's, you know, what you want to talk about.
One of the thanks, Joan. This has been great, but I mean, it's made me realize is you can fill books with what I didn't know. You know, right down to all the different flags. So this has been really a good learning experience, and you know, will be helpful in the future.
Great, thank you. And I'm glad. It's like I said, I'm mired in this. You know, I study gay history, I run a gay organization, and I'm still constantly learning new things, or about groups of people I didn't know about, or identities that I didn't know too much about. And so, you know, everyone starts, you know, so everyone sort of starts at the same place. And so it's good to just kind of be aware and learn more as time goes on. So I'm going to put in the chat. So I have this, like I kept saying, I have this list of resources, and some of them are things I showed you, like the Gender Unicorn. Others are, you know, Harvard Medical School's terminology related to sexual orientation and gender identity. Links to, if you are a history nerd, History Project is not the only historical organization working with LGBTQ people. We are well, there are others in New England. We're the biggest in New England, but there are groups in New York. There's a National Stonewall Museum in Florida. There's the Lesbian History Archives in Brooklyn. So they're kind of out there. And so I have a question about, all right, let's see. Threats to the LGBTQ community. And sort of, so the statistics around drugs, risk, and suicide, which is what this person is asking in the chat, are still pretty abysmal. They're better than what they were. And I can pull up, let's see. I'll try to do two things at the same time, and we'll see how successful I am. I do have some of those statistics written down, especially for youth. They're, you know, here we go. Apologies for the real world. You're seeing how the sausage is made with me and my two screens of notes here. So the stats that I have here were compiled by the Human Rights Campaign in 2017. And so they did a survey of youth between 13 and 17 across America who basically they talked about what it meant to be LGBTQ in America. LGBTQ youth experience negative and hostile school environments. The majority of them do. Even as things have gotten better, bullying puts kids at risk for depression, for suicidal ideation, for misuse of drugs and alcohol, and for risky sexual behavior. Like I said, these numbers are better than what they were in the past. They're still not perfect. I think that if you sort of look across the country, that there's a range in experience. My gut feeling is that Massachusetts is doing a little bit better than some other states where you see, particularly in the news right now, about denying access to healthcare to trans children or trans people under 18, trying to make sure that trans kids can't play sports, you know, bathroom bills across the country, and all these sorts of things basically put people at more risk for things that will hurt them. So like I said, depression, suicidal ideation. The support groups are really helpful. And they have, and I think that's part of why the numbers have changed over time, is that you do have organizations that are working directly in schools like GLSEN, GLSEN, who works to support gay straight alliances in schools. Public perception and visibility of LGBTQ people have changed these statistics. But just in 2017, more of these awful stats, 73% of LGBTQ youth experience verbal threats because of their perceived LGBTQ identity. 70% were bullied. So, the sort of bright side here, the what we can do moment as either LGBTQ people or allies is really to know your rights and to know where those support groups are and where those resources are. So Massachusetts, for instance, has bullying laws that protect LGBTQ students. We have non-discrimination laws and statewide regulations that protect LGBTQ students. And we have groups like the Massachusetts Commission on LGBTQ Youth who support some of these GSA efforts, who support LGBTQ students. And then other, the Trevor Project is another place I would send people to, or the National LGBTQ Hotline. So yeah, there's kind of anecdotally, there was also a study done at Fenway Health at the Fenway Institute in the 90s that basically looked at risk factors for gay men and HIV prevention. And basically they were finding that regardless of the level of risk of somebody, that the rates of transmission were about the same. That has also changed since the 90s. We have things like PrEP, which is pre-exposure prophylaxis. I'm not a doctor. I know it's called PrEP though. And it's a daily medication that people take to ensure that if they are exposed to HIV, that they won't transmit it. So rates are going down there. It's again, like I said, as the world changes and as resources become available to people, if you go to a state like Georgia, HIV transmission rates are still super high. And that's because there's not the same access to healthcare, the same access to wealth, the same access to, especially if you're in a rural area, to healthcare providers who are going to be affirming and open to what your needs are. It's kind of this is a bummer, but we try and we do what we can, and we're working on making things better. There's a question about the etymology of cisgender, and I'm not entirely sure when that starts being used. I will look into that, and I can add that to my list of resources, which is the link that I put in there. I update not super frequently, but when I learn something new, I put it there so that if folks are going back to it later on, they can see what was the last date I updated it and what else might be there. Do we have any other questions? I'm also happy to stick on a couple minutes after too. I know we started a little bit late. All right, I'll riff. So, and folks can think if they have any other questions, and if not, I'll let you get to your afternoons. But yeah, so June is coming up. June is Pride Month, which you may already know. The reason why June is Pride Month, it's the month where the Stonewall riot happened in 1969. Patrons at the Stonewall Inn, which was this bar in New York City, were experiencing a police raid. Police raids on bars were routine across the country. Depending on where you were, New York City had a law that you couldn't serve alcohol to known homosexuals at one point in time. In Boston, there were bars where, sometimes police would get paid off, or there was one bar where they had a switch that you would flip, and if you saw the red light turn on, you knew that you needed to either get away from who you were dancing with, find someone of the opposite sex, or go up to the bar to get a drink so that you wouldn't get arrested for breaking a law against lewd and lascivious behavior or something like that. These laws that no longer exist, that were really morality policing laws. So at the Stonewall Inn, it was the same day as Judy Garland's funeral. There was also a heat wave, emotions were high, and the patrons fought back. And it's not the first time that patrons fought back against police raiding gay bars, but it's the first one that got a lot of attention. So skirmishes happened for like the next week in Sheridan Square, which is where the Stonewall Inn is. And then the next year, homophile organizations, those ones I mentioned way back at the beginning of the conversation, commemorated the Stonewall riots. And those were the first Pride events. In Boston in 1970, we had a teach-in because we have a million colleges and we love education. And in 1971, there was a march specifically for gay rights. And that's what we commemorate every year with Pride. So I see that Sharon's mentioned in the chat, Cohasset Pride Project is doing something with signs and flags. Are you guys selling signs and flags or?
Who posted? Did Carrie, was that you that posted the link?
Yeah, both of us posted, Karen.
I'm a newbie, so I'll let Carrie tell you more.
Yes, so you can request signs and flags for houses, for businesses. We're trying to get the word out, and we're just really excited to celebrate our first Pride in Cohasset. So this event leading up to that, Joan, has been amazing, and I'm really honored to be here. So thank you for doing this.
Oh, good. And that's awesome. That's one thing that I do kind of love. Again, I like to take drives, especially in these COVID times, through like Situate and Cohasset, and Quincy's great, but you know, the scenery is a little bit nicer further down the South Shore. And it's really exciting to see people with the flags out in their yard and the signs out in their yard. And it makes it feel like a welcoming place. And it's super easy if everyone's doing it to put up a flag and to be, you know, affirming and open of, you know, the people who are already part of your community. So that's awesome. Do we have any other questions or comments or any other, when is your Pride happening, Carrie?
So we have the website launched thanks to all of our wonderful organizers, and we're going to try to celebrate it for all of June. And we're figuring out different events and some activities to have. We'll invite you, Joan. You can come down. It can be an excuse to come to Cohasset. We're also celebrating Juneteenth too. Also,
oh wow,
you know, our big diversity and inclusion month for us, and hopefully it'll be annually now that we get to do that. So, still working out all the details, but I'm excited to let everyone know more as soon as we have more details set up in the next couple weeks.
Awesome. Yeah, no, let me know. It's really exciting. I know that I mentioned I grew up in Plymouth. Plymouth has a Pride now. They did not when I was a kid. I also didn't come out until a little after college. And so, but we didn't have, you know, my school didn't have a GSA in the early 2000s. We didn't have a Pride, and things have just changed so much in that short amount of time that it's really just quite amazing. And so, so I will just close it there and say, it has been my absolute pleasure to get to spend some time with you all today. I hope that you learned something. If you have any more questions, please feel free to reach out to me or to check out those resources that I shared. There's a lot of information out there. And really the first step of being curious and learning more is where to start. So thank you for taking the time, and thank you again to Cohasset Elder Affairs and to the Paul Pratt Memorial Library for having me. And I'm always happy to come back, and I'm also always happy to answer questions. So please feel free to reach out to me.
Thank you, Joan. Thank you for joining us today. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, it's my pleasure.
And Joan, send us your best email or phone or best contact info for you. I know you sent the website of the organization.
Oh, yeah. info@historyproject.org goes right to me. And that's the easiest. Then you don't have to spell Ilacqua, which is even better, right?
Yeah.
I'll be in touch. We will want to bring you back for maybe something in June. So I'll let you know.
Cool. Awesome. Thank you. And thank you, Diane. Good to see you.
Same here, Joan. Enjoy the rest of the beautiful day. Thank you for joining us. This has been great.
Oh, thank you. And I'm glad. And thank you, Chief Quigley. I saw you in your car.
You had a couple other officers too. Officer Lennon and Lopes, thank you for coming.
Oh, awesome.
Yeah, somehow my phone overheated in the car. and it shut off. So it's I guess that's a sign it's a nice day out. So I had to. I was just in the village, so I was right around the corner from my office. So I get back here. But very nice job, Joan. Really informative, and I don't know how you keep track of all the acronyms. You're like a government agency.
I try. As a historian, I'm more likely to remember like the decade something happened than the year. That's where all the information drops off. I'm like, you're somewhere in the neighborhood.
There's only room for so much upstairs, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And the other thing, one of the agencies we work with quite often, unfortunately, we have to call them sometimes. We've had some hate crimes, and Mike Lopes, Lieutenant Mike Lopes, is on here. He's our detective commander, but Greg Lennon's our executive officer. The Attorney General's office, Mass Attorney General's office, and she has wonderful civil rights division, and they're the first people we bring in to an investigation to help us, and I think Mike can probably weigh in, but they start off with they hit you with the letter, hit the bad guy with the letter that it's really attention getting, and you don't want mail from the AG, but they've been really great. We've had a couple cases just recently, and it's an attention getter, and the bad behavior stops immediately.
Yeah, good to know. I can add, and actually, I should add Mara Healy to my list of resources and her office. Thank you for mentioning that.
For sure.
Yeah, no, I could talk about this with all of you for hours, but I know people have to go too. So it's like,
all right, I'm gonna jump out then.
All right.
Take care, folks. Nice seeing you. Thanks again, Joan.
Thank you. Oh no, thank you.
Good job.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye, Dan.